The early morning sun spilled across the kitchen table as the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the modest farmhouse. George Harper, 65 and worn by years of hard work and harder heartbreak, sat at the table sipping from his old chipped mug. His eyes, though tired, softened every time they landed on the little boy giggling on the living room floor, his 4-year-old grandson, Liam. Liam was playing with a red toy truck, making engine noises and babbling to himself in a way only a child lost in imagination could. The boy's energy was contagious, a bright light in a house that had seen too much quiet and too little joy in recent years. George smiled gently and shook his head as the toy crashed into the leg of a chair. "Careful, buddy," he said gruffly, though his tone was laced with affection. Liam barely looked up, too invested in whatever adventure the truck was taking him on. George stood, his joints groaning slightly, and walked over to fix the crooked picture frame on the wall, an old photo of George, his late wife Martha, and a much younger Daniel. The photo seemed from another world. Daniel Harper, George's only child, had been a boy with promise once. Bright, curious, always asking questions. But something had gone wrong after Martha died. George, a retired mechanic with grease permanently stained into the lines of his hands, did his best to raise the boy right. But Daniel drifted into bad company, drugs, and impulsive choices that always ended with George picking up the pieces. It had been 4 months since Daniel reappeared, showing up out of the blue on a rainy night with Liam in his arms. He was thinner, with darting eyes and a nervous smile. Said he just needed a few weeks to get back on his feet. Claimed he had a job interview lined up in another city. Promised he'd come back for Liam once he was stable. George had said yes, not for Daniel's sake, but for the little boy clinging to his leg in fear. He hadn't heard from Daniel since. Still, a part of George hadn't been surprised. He had known, deep down, that Daniel wasn't coming back, not anytime soon, and he didn't mind raising Liam. The boy gave his days purpose and his nights warmth. But something about the whole situation gnawed at him. Daniel had always been a smooth talker, too good at making promises he had no intention of keeping. George had spent years watching his son squander chances, lie through his teeth, and leave damage behind. This time, it felt different. Worse. The fact that Daniel had left Liam without so much as a follow-up call raised more than concern. It raised suspicion. George wasn't just worried. He was watching, waiting, because in his gut, something told him this wasn't over. He glanced outside the window, eyes scanning the empty road. The sun was rising higher now, bathing the farm in light. But despite the peaceful scene, George felt the shadow of something dark creeping closer. And this time, he was ready for it. The fire crackled softly in the living room fireplace as Liam slept curled on the couch under a thick wool blanket. George sat across from him in his old recliner, the kind that creaked every time he shifted his weight. A late autumn storm tapped against the windows, and the house seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet, the kind that let old memories sneak in. George leaned his head back and closed his eyes. It had been nearly 30 years ago, but still played in his mind like it had just happened. Martha lying in the hospital bed, pale, her breath shallow. Cancer had eaten through her like a slow, cruel fire. George remembered holding her hand, trying not to let the fear show on his face. Daniel, just 6 years old then, had stood by the door holding a stuffed bear, too young to understand what dying really meant, but old enough to feel the change in the air. After Martha passed, George tried to be both mother and father. He'd get up before dawn to make breakfast, pack lunches, and still clock in at the garage by 7 a.m. He came home greasy, tired, but always made time to help Daniel with homework or watch old westerns together before bed. George worked hard. He thought love and structure would be enough. But it wasn't. By the time Daniel hit 15, things started slipping. First it was skipping school, then fights, then the late-night calls from the sheriff's office. George bailed him out every time. He blamed himself, thinking he'd done something wrong. Maybe been too hard, too distracted. But Daniel never held on to a second chance for long. At 17, Daniel dropped out of school. He took up with the wrong crowd and began experimenting with drugs. George found needles in his backpack once and flushed them in the sink, only to come home a week later to find the TV gone, sold, just like the tools in the garage, the generator, even his wedding ring. One by one, things disappeared, and with them his trust. George opened his eyes, sighing heavily. He got up to check on Liam, adjusting the blanket over the boy's tiny shoulders. His face was peaceful, unaware of the legacy of pain tied to his bloodline. 2 years ago was the last straw. Daniel had promised, again, that he was clean, that he was working at a warehouse and trying to stay straight. George had let him stay for a few weeks. One morning, George went into the barn and found the place stripped. Power tools, scrap metal, old collectibles, all gone. So was Daniel. He didn't call, didn't write, just vanished. That was when George finally told himself he was done. The son he had loved, the boy he raised, was gone, swallowed by addiction and selfishness. George spent the next 2 years in bitter silence, convincing himself there was nothing left to salvage. Until one stormy night, Daniel came back. He knocked on the door like a stranger, hair matted from the rain, holding Liam in his arms. The boy was barely 3, sleepy and clinging to his father's jacket. "I need your help, Dad," Daniel had said, eyes sunken, voice shaking. "Just for a little while. I got a lead on a job in Atlanta. A few weeks, that's all I need. Then I'll come back for him." George hadn't even known he had a grandson. He was stunned, angry, confused, but not heartless. He looked at the boy, small and scared, and something shifted in his chest. He let them in. For 2 days, Daniel stayed. Said all the right things. Claimed he'd been clean for 6 months. Said he was working on getting custody papers sorted. George didn't believe a word of it. But when Daniel said goodbye and left Liam in his care, George didn't stop him. He didn't do it for Daniel. He did it for Liam. Now, months later, with no word from his son, George stood over the boy as he slept and asked himself the question that had haunted him for weeks. Why did Daniel really come back? Something about it never sat right. George had seen too many lies from that boy's mouth to trust anything without proof. And as much as he adored Liam, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "He's not coming back. And if he does, it won't be for love." The first time Daniel showed up again, it was on a chilly Tuesday afternoon. George had been repairing the fence post by the driveway when he heard the familiar rumble of a beat-up Ford pulling in. His heart clenched instinctively, not with hope, but with dread. Daniel stepped out, a wide grin plastered across his face like a man who thought he could fool the world. He was thinner than before, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, and his hands jittered when he lit a cigarette. "Hey, Dad," he called, his voice overly casual, like they hadn't gone months without a word. George nodded stiffly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't expect to see you." "Yeah, well, been busy, you know. Things are finally looking up." Daniel's eyes darted around, barely meeting George's gaze. There was an edge of desperation under the bravado, something George had seen too many times before. Still, he kept his face neutral, unwilling to start a fight with Liam napping inside. Daniel kicked at the dirt with the toe of his boot. "Say, I'm a little short right now. You think you could spot me $100? Just until Friday." George narrowed his eyes, but said nothing for a moment. Then, slowly, he pulled a wrinkled bill from his wallet and handed it over. Better to avoid a scene. Better to keep Liam's world calm. But it wasn't the last time. Daniel started dropping by more often, always unannounced, always with some excuse. One day, it was gas money. Another day, it was groceries. Always promises to pay George back. Promises that dissolved into thin air. It wasn't just the money, either. Daniel asked questions that made George's gut churn with unease. "So, you still got that pension from the plant, right?" Daniel asked one evening over a hurried cup of coffee. "Bet that's a nice cushion. Bet you're sitting real pretty out here." George stared at him over the rim of his cup. "It's enough." "What?" Daniel laughed awkwardly, waving the question away. "No reason. No reason. Just, good to know you're secure. Family should look out for each other, right?" George didn't answer. He simply studied his son, noticing the twitch of his eye, the way he couldn't keep his foot still under the table. The next morning, George heard something troubling. Mrs. Abernathy, the widow who ran the general store, caught him by the hand as he picked up some supplies. "Your boy's been hanging round town," she said in a low voice. "Seen him talking to some rough-looking fellas behind the gas station. Strangers, not from around here." George's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Thanks for letting me know." The whole drive back home, George's mind raced. What was Daniel getting into now? Drugs? Gambling? Something worse? Whatever it was, George was certain of one thing. Daniel wasn't back because he missed Liam or because he cared about family. He was back because he needed something. That night, after tucking Liam into bed and checking the locks twice, George sat in the living room with the lights off, the cool metal of his old revolver heavy in his lap. It had been years since he even thought about the weapon. But old instincts die hard when you've lived a life watching the people you love destroy themselves. Through the window, George watched the moonlit road. He told himself he wasn't scared. He was prepared. There was a difference. He wasn't just protecting himself now. He was protecting Liam, the only pure thing left in the wreckage Daniel had made of their family. And if Daniel thought he could lie, cheat, or threaten his way back into their lives, he was about to find out how wrong he was. The morning started like any other. George rose early, just as the first gray light of dawn crept across the fields. He shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and set a pot of coffee brewing. The house was unusually quiet, but that didn't alarm him at first. Liam sometimes slept in, tangled up in his blankets, his little feet poking out at odd angles. George smiled at the thought and poured himself a cup. After a few sips, he decided to let the boy sleep a little longer. It was Sunday after all, but by 8:30, the uneasy feeling had settled into his bones. He set down his mug and went to check Liam's room. The bed was empty. At first, George reasoned that maybe Liam had wandered outside. He checked the backyard, the barn, even the tool shed. He called out the boy's name over and over, his voice growing sharper, more frantic. No answer. By the time George circled back to the house, cold dread had twisted itself around his spine. He stormed from room to room, checking closets, under beds, behind doors. Nothing. The house was still, almost too still, as if Liam had never been there at all. Then George noticed something else. The front door. It was unlocked. He always locked the doors at night. It was second nature. And last night, he was sure he had checked them twice. His stomach sank. George grabbed his phone and tried calling Daniel first, heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. The line rang and rang, until finally a robotic voice told him the number was no longer in services. Swearing under his breath, George called the sheriff's office. Within half an hour, 2 deputies arrived in their cruisers. They listened patiently as George, wild-eyed and shaking, explained that his 4-year-old grandson had disappeared sometime during the night, and that his estranged son was missing too. They took notes, nodded grimly. But when George finished, the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Carter, scratched his chin and said, "Mr. Harper, from the sound of it, this might just be a custody thing. Your son is the boy's biological father, right?" George stiffened. He gave up his rights. There are no custody papers. He abandoned Liam here months ago. Carter sighed, the kind of sigh lawmen gave when they knew things were about to get messy. Without formal paperwork, it's a gray area. Technically, Daniel could claim he's just reclaiming his kid. George slammed his fist on the kitchen table, making the deputies jump. Liam wouldn't go with him. Not willingly. He's scared of Daniel. He barely knows him. And Daniel's no father. He's a goddamn criminal. Carter raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Look, we'll put out a notice. We'll check his last known addresses, talk to people around town. But if this is a family dispute, our hands are kind of tied unless we find proof that the boy's in danger." George stared at them, realizing with mounting horror that the people who were supposed to help him weren't going to do a damn thing. Not quickly enough, anyway. He knew Daniel. He knew the way his son lied with a smile, twisted truths until even decent folks couldn't tell right from wrong. And he knew, deep in his gut, that Daniel hadn't taken Liam out of some fatherly love or longing. Daniel had taken him for something else. Money. Drugs. God knew what else. George sat down heavily at the table, his hands trembling. His mind raced through every conversation, every warning sign he'd ignored. Daniel asking about his pension, Daniel meeting shady men behind the gas station. This wasn't just a bad decision. This was a betrayal, a theft of the only thing George had left worth living for. And he would get Liam back, no matter what it took. George didn't waste a second waiting for the sheriff's office to act. Every instinct in his body told him that time was running out, and that no official badge or deputy was going to bring Liam home. He started where he knew Daniel always ended up when he was desperate, the seediest parts of town, the places good folks avoided after dark. First, George tried Daniel's old haunts, the crumbling bar by the rail yard, the abandoned trailer park on the outskirts. No one admitted to seeing him, but George knew how to get people talking. He carried a wad of cash and the hard, cold stare of a man who'd lost everything. Under the right pressure, even the most loyal lowlifes cracked. After a day of dead ends, George found a lead, a kid barely out of his teens who worked the back door of the bar. Daniel, the kid muttered, fidgeting with his hoodie strings. Yeah, I seen him. A few nights back. He was with some guy named Rico. Owed him money big time. George pried for more. Names. Locations. Anything. By nightfall, he had another address. A roach-infested motel 3 towns over. George drove through the night, heart hammering, gripping the steering, like it was the only thing keeping him from losing his mind. When he arrived, he didn't even bother knocking. He pounded on the cracked motel door until a scraggly man in a stained shirt answered, his eyes wide with fear. I don't want no trouble, the man babbled. I swear to God, I was just the middleman. George grabbed him by the collar. Where's my grandson? The man whimpered, his breath stinking of cheap whiskey. Gone. Long gone. Your boy, Daniel, he sold him. $800. I swear, I just handled the papers. George felt the world tilt under him. For a moment, he thought he might black out. The man, seeing George's deadly expression, continued in a rush, desperate to save himself. Black market adoption ring, he gasped. Couple from over the border, they wanted a kid bad. No background checks, no waiting lists. Cash and go. Daniel didn't care, man. He just wanted the money to pay off some gambling debt. George released him roughly, disgusted. His stomach churned. His fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. Daniel hadn't just abandoned Liam. He had sold him like cattle. George stumbled back to his truck, the truth sinking into his bones like ice water. His son, his flesh and blood, had betrayed him in a way he couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. Still shaking, George called the sheriff's office, relaying every detail through gritted teeth. The deputy on the other end of the line said all the right words. Thank you, Mr. Harper. We'll escalate this. We'll involve the authorities across state lines. But George heard the familiar bureaucracy in his tone. Paperwork, meetings, procedures. They would move slow, too slow. And every moment they hesitated, Liam was getting farther away. George hung up the phone without another word, his decision already made. He wasn't waiting for permission. He was going to find Liam himself, even if it meant tearing the whole world apart to do it. The rundown motel on the edge of town looked more like a condemned building than a place anyone would willingly stay. The neon sign buzzed weakly, and a handful of broken-down cars were scattered across the gravel lot. George pulled his truck into a shadowy corner, his heart a block of ice in his chest. Room 9. That's what the kid at the front desk had mumbled after George slipped him a $50 bill. George grabbed the revolver from under his seat. It was old but well-maintained, a relic from his younger days when living out in the country meant being ready for anything. He tucked it under his jacket, steeling himself. Every step toward that door felt heavier than the last. When he finally stood in front of room 9, George didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open with a sudden force that rattled it on its hinges. Inside, Daniel was slumped on a filthy bed, surrounded by empty beer cans and crumpled fast food wrappers. The air reeked of sweat and despair. He looked up, startled, his eyes glassy and red-rimmed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. George walked in slowly, closing the door behind him with a deliberate click. His face was calm, almost eerily so, but inside, a storm raged hotter and wilder than anything he'd ever felt before. Daniel scrambled to his feet. Dad, listen. Sit down, George said, his voice low and deadly. Daniel obeyed without argument, sinking back on a mattress like a whipped dog. George stared at him for a long moment, taking in the pathetic sight, the hollow cheeks, the trembling hands, the smell of failure clinging to him like a second skin. "Why?" George finally asked, his voice cracking under the weight of the word. "Why would you do this to him?" "To me?" Daniel buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. It took him a long time to speak. "I was broke," he mumbled. "I owed money to bad people. I was using again. I didn't know what else to do. I thought," he choked on his words, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "I thought maybe Liam would end up in a better home, with people who could give him more. A real chance." George's fists clenched at his sides. He fought the urge to lunge forward, to shake Daniel until his bones rattled. "You sold him," George said, voice dripping with disgust. "For $800. You gave him away like he was a sack of trash." Daniel started crying then, ugly, broken sobs that filled the grimy little room. But George felt nothing. No pity, no sorrow, only a hollow ache where his heart used to be. Slowly, almost thoughtfully, George reached under his jacket and pulled out the revolver. The weight of it in his hand was both familiar and foreign. Daniel's eyes widened when he saw it. "Dad, please. I made a mistake. I can fix it. I can help you find him." George shook his head slowly. "You don't fix something like this, son." For the first time in his life, Daniel saw the full measure of his father's fury. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, inevitable, like a noose tightening around a neck. Daniel slid off the bed onto his knees, hands raised. "Please, Dad, I'm your son." George leveled the revolver at him, his finger tightening on the trigger. "No," George said, voice trembling. "You were my son." Daniel fell to his knees, palms pressed together as if prayer could somehow erase what he had done. Tears streamed down his face, raw, unfiltered terror twisting his features. "Please, Dad, please don't do this," Daniel sobbed. "I messed up, I know I did, but I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was desperate. You don't understand. I had no choice." His words came fast, slurred together, a frantic attempt to shift the blame onto anything and anyone but himself. George stood over him, revolver steady in his hand, his face carved from stone. There was no anger now, only an exhausted, crushing sadness that weighed heavier than any rage ever could. "No choice," George repeated, his voice a low rumble. "You had every choice in the world, and you chose to sell your own son for $800. Daniel shook his head violently. "I was scared. I was broke. I thought it would be better for him. I thought he'd be safe." George took a step closer. The gun never wavered. "You didn't think about him," George said, voice sharper now. "You only thought about yourself, like you always have." Daniel broke down completely, crumpling onto the floor, his body racked with sobs. "I'm your son, your blood. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" George stared down at him, his own heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He thought about the little boy who used to ride on his shoulders, who used to beg him to fix up old bicycles and build tree houses. He thought about the man that boy had become, a man who traded flesh and blood for drug money without a second thought. "You sold blood," George said, his voice as cold as a grave. "So now you pay in blood." Daniel opened his mouth to scream, but the gunshot rang out before he could make a sound. The impact threw Daniel backward onto the filthy motel carpet, a dark stain blooming across his chest. His body twitched once, then stilled. George stood there for a moment, the gun hanging limply at his side. The silence after the shot was deafening. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt empty. Slowly, methodically, he stood over Daniel's lifeless body for only a moment longer, his breathing steady, his heart hammering in his chest. He wiped the revolver clean and tucked it back into his belt. There would be no police this time, no confessions, no handcuffs. Daniel had made his choice, and now George would make his. Quickly, he moved through the shabby motel room, wiping down every surface he had touched. He took the few crumpled bills from Daniel's wallet, what little remained from the monstrous act he had committed. George then staged the room to look like a robbery gone wrong. Drawers pulled out, belongings scattered, the door left slightly ajar. With grim efficiency, George doused parts of the room with the motel's cheap alcohol he found in the mini-fridge and lit a small fire in the corner, just enough to cause smoke, enough to confuse. He didn't stay to watch. He climbed back in his truck, his mind clear, focused. His mission wasn't finished. Earlier, during his frantic search for Liam, George had managed to track down details on the couple who had adopted Liam illegally, a shady suburban family desperate enough to ignore the dark legality of the transaction. Now, armed with that information, George set off across state lines, the road stretching endlessly before him. By the time he reached the quiet neighborhood where the couple lived, it was near midnight. George parked 2 blocks away and approached the house on foot, dressed in dark clothing, blending into the night. He didn't bother knocking. Using skills he hadn't touched in decades, George quietly jimmied open a side window and slipped inside. The house smelled of cheap perfume and stale air. He moved silently down the hallway until he found a small bedroom, decorated with cartoon posters and a toy chest. And there, curled up on a twin bed, was Liam. George's chest tightened. For a moment, he simply watched the boy breathe, making sure it was really him. Then, with infinite gentleness, he scooped Liam up into his arms. Liam stirred, blinking up at him sleepily. "Grandpa," he whispered. "Sure, little man," George murmured, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I'm taking you home." He left the way he came, melting into the night. By the time the illegal adoptive couple realized Liam was gone, George was miles away, and they were too afraid of exposing their own crimes to call the police right away. George knew he couldn't stay in the United States. Eventually, someone would piece things together. Foster care, police, endless questions. They would destroy Liam's life even more. He wouldn't let that happen. Tapping into old contact from his military days, George arranged for fake passports under new names. It wasn't cheap, but between the money he had left and the favors he could still call in, he made it happen. 2 weeks later, George and Liam boarded a rusty cargo ship posing as a grandfather and grandson emigrating for work. Their destination, South America, Uruguay. The small countryside home where they settled was nothing fancy, just a stone house surrounded by open fields and the scent of wildflowers. But it was safe. It was home. On the porch, George sat in a worn rocking chair, a cup of coffee in his hand, his body older and more tired than ever. In the yard, Liam ran barefoot through the grass, laughing, chasing a stray dog that had adopted them. For the first time in years, George smiled, a real, deep smile. His hands, stained by sin, rested protectively over the small boy's jacket as Liam climbed onto his lap, giggling. A warm sunset bathed the fields in gold as George spoke softly, more to himself than anyone else. "I had to do what the world wouldn't. I broke every law for love, but I'd do it all again, because no one sells my blood and walks away." As Liam fell asleep against his chest, George closed his eyes, rocking gently as the night wrapped around them. The past was gone. Only the future remained, and this time it belonged to them.